Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode in our Tundra Connection series. I'm Elisa McCall with Polar Bears International, and we're so excited to have you on today's webcast. We are coming to you live from Tundra Buggy 1 on the shores of Hudson Bay, just outside of Churchill, Manitoba, during the annual polar bear gathering in this area. So we have polar bears just outside right now. We've got one right off the nose of Buggy 1 and a couple farther behind us. So today we'll be keeping an eye on the polar bears around while we talk about them, which we love to do. So today's webcast is called Hacking Hybrids. We're going to be talking about adaptations, genetics, Grolar bears for a minute, and we're very excited to tell you what we know about polar bear genetics and then also hear what you want to know. So please send us your questions. You can put them in the chat box wherever you're watching this from, whether you're on the polarbearsinternational.org website, on Facebook, on explore.org. Please send us your questions, and we have people keeping an eye out, and they can send them to me, and we'll try to get to them later this broadcast. So this will run for roughly half an hour to 40 minutes, depending on how many questions we get. And we are targeting roughly grades 8 to 12 today, but anybody is welcome to join and watch and have a good time. So let's go. Thanks again, everyone. We're so happy to be here with you. What are adaptations? What's an adaptation? I bet many of you have heard that word before, and we are just going to launch right into a little video to explain a bit about adaptations. And remember, think of questions to send us later.
Polar bears live across the Arctic in some of the coldest places on the planet. They walk across the Arctic sea ice looking for their main prey, seals. And they have some traits that help them do this and survive in this crazy cold environment. Polar bears have very thick fur that helps keep them warm. In fact, they have two layers of fur. They have a thick, fuzzy, downy layer right next to their skin, which would be like us wearing a woolly sweater. And then they have a layer of guard hairs, longer hairs over top. It's kind of like their raincoat. And these two layers of fur help keep them warm even when it's minus 40 degrees. Polar bear hair is clear and hollow. It just looks white to our eyes. And the hollowness helps trap warm air against their bodies. Polar bear skin is black. We don't really know why, but we think it might help them absorb heat. Polar bears have an amazing sense of smell. Their nose has so much surface area to pick up scents in the air. They can smell prey over a kilometer away when the wind is right. Polar bears have huge paws. They can be the size of dinner plates. The big paws help spread out the polar bear's weight on the sea ice so they can walk along really thin ice if they have to. Polar bear feet can also get smelly. When females are ready to mate, they send out signals through smelly footprints on the sea ice. And a male polar bear who picks up the scent will follow a female, sometimes for days on end. Polar bear paws are also kind of sticky. They have bumps or papillae on the bottom of their feet that help grip the ice as they're walking, kind of like your winter tires. They also have fur on their feet to help keep them warm and really sharp claws that help give them traction on the ice so they don't slip. Polar bear claws are thick and sharp. Their claws help them pull out slippery seals from underneath the water up onto the sea ice. Polar bears also have very big heads with really sharp teeth that helps them hunt their prey seals. You can see they've got big canines at the front, and then they've got very sharp back molars that help them shear blubber and fat off of their prey. The diastema, or the gap between the front sharp canines and the back molars, is perfect for helping polar bears grab a seal out of the water and pull it out onto the sea ice. You can see that all of these adaptations make a polar bear perfectly suited to live in the Arctic. They need sea ice to travel, hunt, find mates, and sometimes to den. Please join us in taking action to help conserve polar bears and the sea ice they depend on.
Great. So hopefully that video gave you an amazing sort of sense of the adaptations that polar bears have to live across the Arctic. They are a blubber hunting ice bear. They are a highly specialized carnivore that has adapted to live in this cold, icy environment. They love to be out on that sea ice hunting seals. That is where their bodies have evolved to live. They live across the Arctic in 20 populations. It used to be 19, and this year we updated that to 20, which we can talk a little bit more about later. And we find them in the circumpolar north, so everywhere that has sea ice, but not really right at the North Pole. The water's too deep there. There's not a lot of seals. It's dark and not productive. We say an area is productive when there's lots of food to eat, and that includes Hudson Bay. Where we are right now, we're on the shores of Hudson Bay, so one of those kind of more southern populations that you see on the map there. And the polar bears are here right now because in this area, the sea ice was melted all summer long. So the polar bears come onto land to rest, to conserve energy. And then when that sea ice freezes up in the coming weeks, the polar bears will head out right away to go hunt seals again. But for now, it gives us a great opportunity to watch them. And by watching them, we can really see that, again, they are an ice bear. They are not a terrestrial bear like their closest cousin, the brown bear. Brown bears are much more suited for living on land. They have different shaped claws that are more suited for example, pulling up logs or digging for roots. Brown bears have a shorter face, kind of more of a concave look, whereas polar bears have kind of a long, we call it almost a Roman nose, sometimes more curved. Polar bears have longer necks that assist them when they're swimming in water. Of course, the fur looks very different, which you can tell right away. There's lots of differences, but as we'll find out soon, there's also some similarities, and they're so closely related that they can interbreed. So it's time for us to bring our special guest over and introduce her. I would like to introduce you to Dr. Ruth Rivkin, who is an amazing geneticist who's been focusing on some polar bear genetics in the Arctic. Hi, Ruth. We're so happy to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Elisa. Thanks for having me on here. I'm excited to share some of what I know about polar bear evolution and DNA and adaptations.
So, Ruth, I'm going to ask you first, can you explain a little bit to the audience what is DNA? We talk about genetics and DNA. Let's explain what that is first.
So, DNA is an acronym that stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It forms the building blocks of all life on Earth. So, you can think about DNA as a recipe book that makes us who we are. DNA is formed up of individual molecules that bind together and create a genetic code for each individual organism on the planet that includes humans and that includes polar bears. One important feature of DNA is that it's heritable. So, what that means is that DNA is passed on from parent to offspring. And so, changes that parents experience can be passed on to their offspring. And that allows for evolution to take place. When we think about evolution, we're often thinking about the change that happens ultimately at the DNA level. Now, DNA can help decide everything from our individual alleles or individual bits of DNA that form chromosomes, all the way up to different traits. So that beautiful white coat that polar bears have, that is all explained through changes in DNA.
Very cool stuff. I would love if you're in your classroom right now, maybe be thinking to yourself about other adaptations you notice, changes in DNA in other animals or even in humans. What sort of DNA do humans have that make us specially suited to our world? Pretty cool stuff. So, Ruth, one of the questions we often get asked is how old are polar bears as a species? At what point did they split off from brown bears, and how do we even know that?
So, polar bears are a fairly young species. And what we mean by young is they evolved from brown bears approximately 500,000 years ago. We have some good estimates, although this is still an approximation. And we think that they evolved to take advantage of the new Arctic that was emerging in the world. And so, this was a new environment that brown bears weren't particularly well suited to, but over time, polar bears adapted and became highly specialized Arctic predators. We think that this change took place over approximately 300,000 years. So we have fossil records that have emerged showing the intermediate stages between brown bear all the way up to polar bear. And we know that they underwent some very quick changes in terms of how well they are able to cope with the cold environment. For example, their dense white fur had to go through a big shift from that brown fur that brown bears have all the way to that dense white double coat. We know also that they became very specialized in what they eat. Brown bears are what we call generalist species, so they will eat just about anything that they can get their hands on or their paws on. Whereas polar bears are almost entirely dependent on seals in the Arctic. And this was a very big shift in diet for this species as it evolved. And so polar bears are very, very good at taking blubber from seals and metabolizing that and putting it into their own body in the sense of becoming very fat. Most polar bears have to fast for a very long time through the summer when they're not on the sea ice. And so what that means is that they need to be as fat as possible when they're coming off the sea ice. And so they have evolved to be extremely efficient eaters of seal blubber specifically.
They really are a very special bear. They're so specialized, and thank you so much for walking us through some of those concepts of polar bear genetics. I just think what you do is so cool. One of the cool things you did this year was you had a research paper come out, and you talked about SNPs, which is a genetic term that maybe you could explain a bit more for us. Like, what are SNPs and why are they important?
Yeah, of course. So we in genetics we use a lot of different acronyms. SNPs stand for single nucleotide polymorphisms, and that's a big fancy way of saying variation at the DNA level. So a single SNP is a single change in DNA at a particular site in a chromosome. What a SNP does sometimes is cause a trait change, it sometimes causes a gene change, or sometimes it doesn't do anything. It really depends on where that SNP is located. If it's in a very important location in a chromosome, then it's going to have a big effect on the individual. Now, why we care about SNPs is that they have the potential to drive evolutionary change in all species. And this is particularly true for polar bears, which we know have evolved very quickly. But on another level, the variation in SNPs or the genetic variation that individuals and populations contain is a very important predictor of conservation status. So we know that the more genetic variation that species have, the more likely they are to be able to adapt to changing environments. And this is extremely important for polar bears, which are living in one of the fastest changing environments in the entire world. So the more genetic variation that they contain, the more SNPs that they contain, the more likely they will be able to adapt to climate change and warming temperatures in Arctic. And so what we did was we looked at just how much genetic variation was found across the Canadian Arctic to get a sense of which subpopulations, these are the 20 different groups of bears, that have been designated for both management and biological difference purposes. And we wanted to know which of these subpopulations are potentially more vulnerable to climate change, which might need some special help with surviving sea ice loss that's happening through warming temperatures. And so to do this, we looked at just how much variation was in these different subpopulations.
That is fascinating. I love that work. Can you explain a bit more about that? What did you find from looking at the potential adaptive ability of polar bears in different areas? Were there differences that you found across the Arctic?
We did find differences. One thing that's important to note is that polar bears lost a lot of their genetic variation when they evolved from grizzly bears. This is because this change happened so quickly that it was a little bit hard for the polar bear population to keep up with just how much adaptation was happening. And so they're starting from a bit of a loss because they already have low genetic variation. So we know that adaptive potential or the likelihood that populations will continue to adapt is pretty low in polar bears because they've lost so much genetic variation. But we see that it's really in these northern populations, which are small and very isolated, that have the least amount of genetic variation. And so it's these subpopulations that are probably going to struggle the most with adapting to warming temperatures. That's not to say that they won't adapt, simply that they might have a little bit more trouble. And we may need to think carefully about these subpopulations when we're designing conservation strategies and thinking about how we can best preserve polar bears across the entire Arctic.
So, one thing we hear about is the Grolar bear, and some people ask if this could help polar bears in a way. If brown bears and polar bears are interbreeding, is this adding genetic diversity to polar bears? Is this a good thing for them? Can you tell us a little bit about the Grolar bear and what that means for the species?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting case because most species can't reproduce. When we think about what makes a species, typically it means that they can't breed with any other species. But polar bears and grizzly bears are one of the exceptions that can. And this is because they didn't evolve all that long ago. So they're fairly closely related still. Grolar bears are just one way of talking about polar bear, grizzly bear, brown bear hybrids. You may have also heard them called pizzly bears. These are the same thing. It's basically a bear that had a mom or a dad for a polar bear and a mom or a dad for a brown bear. So whether or not hybridization is going to help polar bears is a very tricky question because it depends on just how much hybridization is happening. A small amount of hybridization between brown bears and polar bears may help polar bears adapt by introducing some of those warmer adapted genetic variants from grizzly or brown bears into the polar bear population. And so this might help polar bears evolve just by introducing these new variants into their population and giving them more material to adapt from. But on the other hand, too much hybridization might reverse all of the changes that evolution that took place during the evolution of polar bears in the first place. And so we might see the loss of polar bears as a unique species if we see that hybridization is happening too quickly or there's too much hybridization. And we know that this is a possible scenario because there was a polar bear population thousands of years ago in Alaska that began to breed with grizzly bears and over time turned back into grizzly bears. They evolved back into grizzly bears. And so this population is very unique because they have a signal in their DNA of polar bears, but they are functionally grizzly bears. They look like grizzly bears, they behave like grizzly bears, and they have the same diet as grizzly bears. So this is a really interesting case of what could happen if hybridization happens too much across the entire Arctic. And this is a fun photo on the screen here of the differences between polar bears and grizzly bears. You can see their paws are very different. Grizzly bears typically don't live in Arctic environments, and so they don't need to have fuzzy feet the way that polar bears do. But you can see that they're still very similar in their shape and structure.
Fascinating. This is so interesting. So, Grolar bears will remain fairly rare, but we might see more of them over time. But yeah, it sounds like they have a lot to teach us, even if they're kind of this unique species out there. Very interesting. Thank you so much, Ruth. Okay, we are going to come back to Ruth soon. We are hoping that everyone in your classrooms, you can take a minute to brainstorm a question or two and send them in to us. We're going to play a little video clip while you guys brainstorm, and I've got a couple other questions I can answer while we're giving Dr. Ruth a quick break here. So we're going to show you some fun footage of what we've been watching out here in the last few days on Tundra Buggy 1 and on the explore.org cameras. So we got a great question on our website. Do polar bears and brown bears fight each other? It's a good question. To fight each other would take a lot of energy that probably neither bear wants to really expend. We know from some anecdotes that where we have cases where there is a whale carcass on land, so for example, up in northern Alaska on the North Slope, there have been multiple eyewitness accounts of there will be this whale carcass and, a dozen polar bears eating on it, and one brown bear will come over to feed, and the polar bears will kind of scatter. Generally, brown bears are more aggressive than polar bears. Brown bears are territorial. They might be a little more likely to fight than polar bears. So we wouldn't expect the species to necessarily fight all the time. When it comes down to resources on land, I'm sure it's happened before. And we could probably argue about who would win that fight, but it would really depend on the size of the bear and probably like so. Interesting question. And we know that sometimes they'll mate as well. From Dr. Ruth. Okay, so I'm gonna save that one for Ruth. I've got a question about their fur. What does their fur feel like? Is it similar to a husky's fur? It does feel kind of similar to a husky's fur. In some pictures, they look kind of fluffy and soft, but really they're a bit more coarse. They've got two thick layers of fur, an adaptation to living in the cold, icy Arctic. Their undercoat of fur is very thick and dense, like a sweater, and then their overcoat is more like a rain jacket, longer guard hairs. And so when you feel it, it's quite thick and a bit rough, like a dog, a German Shepherd, or a Husky, absolutely. And that fur is hollow, which you heard in that video. It helps trap warm air against their body. So very neat adaptation. We have another question about possibly feeding polar bears, if they're getting quite hungry and there's no ice around. That's something that we would usually rather not do. We don't want polar bears to ever get reliant on a human food source like that. Ultimately, we want to protect their Arctic sea ice habitat so that the polar bears can go out there, continue their natural lifestyle, and go hunt seals. In an emergency situation, that is one of the many options on the table, is kind of feeding polar bears away from a town so that they're not all coming into a town. But it's not a long-term solution for the protection of the species, and it would be very expensive, very time-consuming, and we might as well put those sorts of resources into reducing carbon emissions and switching to more renewable energies. So really good question, though. And I should explain for a second what you're seeing on the camera. So we've been seeing quite a bit of this the last couple days. This is what we call sparring. So at this time of the year in this area and a few other areas around the world, but this area is kind of famous for seeing it, we sometimes see healthy, generally young adult males sparring, so play fighting. We think that they're kind of maybe practicing for the spring when fighting gets real over mates. Maybe they're just wanting some exercise because they've been hanging out on land for several months and they're kind of bored. They seem to maybe form these kind of short-term relationships with each other where they'll kind of hang out and spar over several days and rest nearby each other. These two same bears are kind of, well, we think the same bears are just over still behind us, days later from this sparring. So it's sure fun to watch. They'll go for a little while. The other day they sparred for about 20 minutes and then they had a big nap. So mostly at this time of the year, there's a lot of napping. So when we see this sparring, it's extra fun and special. And man, we were saying yesterday, they can really go, even when they're play fighting, they are strong. It's incredible. Okay, thank you for your questions. Do keep sending them in if you have them. We're going to bring back Dr. Ruth for a couple more questions and then we'll start wrapping up. This has been a really great episode on genetics so far. Okay, Ruth, can you still hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, a question for you. Do we know why polar bears evolved so quickly and relatively recently? And are they going to keep up with climate change? You kind of alluded to this earlier, but maybe you could give us another answer.
Yeah, so polar bears evolved so quickly because they were able to capitalize on the Arctic, which was a new environment that was emerging. So the world hasn't always had the Arctic where it was covered entirely by sea ice. It was quite a bit warmer for a while. And so when the Earth cooled down again and the ice caps formed again, polar bears were able to move out into that new habitat, and that drove them to evolve and adapt to living in a cold environment on the sea ice. The question about whether polar bears can adapt now to climate change is, again, another complicated one. And that's because climate change is happening at a pace that we haven't seen before. So we know that the world is warming much faster than it previously has. And so this presents a challenge for polar bears because the pace of environmental change in the Arctic might simply be too fast for them to evolve. Evolution takes place between generations. And so, in order for a species to adapt to something like sea ice loss in the Arctic, they need enough time to be able to pass those adaptations on to their offspring. Polar bears have a generation time of around 10 years. So that means that it takes a female polar bear 10 years to produce her first litter. And so this means that change in polar bears is slow, even though, when we're thinking about how they evolved, we're saying it's fast. But of course, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years. And so because climate change is happening in hundreds of years instead of hundreds of thousands of years, that really narrows the window down for polar bears. That doesn't mean that they can't adapt. And certainly the pressure for polar bears to adapt in the Arctic is very strong. And so if they have enough time to do so, I'm almost certain we will see some adaptations emerging, whether that's at the trait level, so those physical changes, or at the genetic.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. We've got another great question, and it's about hibernation. So, why don't polar bears hibernate? And this is a great point. We know that grizzly bears, brown bears hibernate every winter, and that polar bears do not have true hibernation. They come onto land in the summer and they sleep a lot and they rest a lot and they might make day beds, but we only see some sort of hibernation in pregnant females that go into dens to give birth. Have you come across anything about hibernation in, for example, Grolar bears? Would Grolar bears hibernate, or what do we know about hibernation?
That's a good question. So roller bears do whatever their mom does. Polar bears are mammals like us, and they learn from their families. And so, because it's mom who raises the cubs, whether they're polar bears or roller bears, we know that if she's a polar bear, she's going to raise her cubs to act like polar bears. And since polar bears don't typically dig dens, they don't hibernate. The roller bears that we know of haven't hibernated. Now, there's a couple issues. We only have 8 cases of hybridization, so it's an incredibly rare event at this point, and so we would really need more roller bears around to be able to fully assess whether or not, they would need to hibernate the way that some grizzly bears do. Now, it's interesting because grizzly bears or brown bears, I keep changing how I'm calling them, but they are referred to both ways. We're still talking about the brown grizzly bear here. Not all grizzly bears hibernate either. And so they will if certain conditions are met, but if food is available to them, they won't always enter hibernation. And so this is pretty consistent with polar bears who, unless they're in a region of the Arctic where there's very limited sea ice, have longer access to food than most grizzly bears would throughout the year.
Very cool. Thank you for that, Ruth. We have a couple more quick questions we'll get through here. Great questions, by the way. Thank you, everyone. So, you mentioned, paraphrasing, that the more northern populations are maybe less genetically diverse than these ones down south, like Churchill. What makes these Churchill bears possibly more genetically diverse than other populations?
That's another good question. So, genetic variation depends on a couple things. So, we know that in populations that are larger, there's more genetic variation because there's simply more individuals to bring in those new and unique genetic variants. And so in the Western Hudson Bay, although population sizes have decreased recently, it still has one of the largest populations across the entire Arctic. And so they are in the southern Arctic, they just have more polar bears in those areas. And so there's more genetic variation because of that. There's also more more genetic transmission between polar bear populations in the south. They tend to be less isolated than they are up north. And so, what this means is that polar bears are moving around more and they're bringing with them their genetic variation. And so, they're able to spread the genetic variation across the southern Arctic in a way that some of the isolated populations in the north aren't able to. And so, this also increases their genetic variation.
Perfect. Another quick question. Can hybrids reproduce? Are they fertile?
They are fertile. Yeah. So I mentioned we know of 8 roller bears that have existed in the wild. And so these all came from a single family, which is very interesting. So there was a single female polar bear who mated with 2 grizzly bears, and she produced 4 roller bear cubs. Then one of her cubs mated again with those 2 grizzly bears, one of which was her father, and produced another litter of Grolar bears. These ones were 75% grizzly bear because their mom was half polar bear, half grizzly bear. And so through that little family, we know that Grolar bears can produce cubs, and that the cases of the Grolar bears in the wild might be restricted to this one slightly bizarre family that existed in the Western Pacific.
Slightly bizarre families for sure. I'm sure we all know a slightly bizarre family or two. Thank you so much, Ruth. Some really interesting topics today. Great questions, everyone. Last question for you, and then we'll let you go. How can understanding genetics and this kind of field of genes help us better conserve polar bears, protect the species?
So we know that genetic variation is an essential part of biodiversity. And so by quantifying the amount of genetic variation in populations and understanding how these bears might be able to evolve and adapt to climate change, we can design our strategies for conservation to be optimized to really help polar bears. And so while the work that I'm doing is an important component of that, ultimately the best thing that we can do for polar bears is lower our emissions. We need to give them as much time as possible to evolve to warmer temperatures. And that means that if we can do anything at all to slow the pace of climate change, those are the most important actions that we can be taking.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Thank you for your time and expertise. It was great having you today. Much appreciated. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It's been wonderful to have you on another Tundra Connections webcast. We'd love to thank our partners, Frontiers North Adventures, who loan us Buggy One every year, as well as explore.org. Never stop learning. Check out the polar bear cams all season long. We'll be here for weeks. There's multiple cams across the tundra. And then in different seasons, you can check out the Northern Lights cam, the beluga whale cam in Churchill in the summer, and then, of course, the dozens and dozens of other amazing wildlife cams that explore.org has. If you are a teacher, please check out our website for free lessons and units. We have all sorts of free materials online. And please do consider filling out our survey after this broadcast. Everyone that fills out a survey will get a free eco adoption. So you can do an eco adoption of a polar bear for your class. And to everyone out there watching, no matter how young or old you are, you can help us protect polar bears. Your voice matters, even if you're not old enough to vote. Even talking about polar bears and conservation, or just the things you care about in your life, is so important. Conversations can shift societies and what we find is appropriate for our world and what we deserve. We have a shared future with polar bears, so everything we're doing for them is good for us too, and we all deserve a bright future. We're going to head out on a really great video, so check this video out, and we hope to see you next time on the Tundra. Future generations of people and polar bears depend on the decisions and plans that we make today. A polar bear's life cycle is almost exclusively tied to the sea ice. Because polar bears rely on sea ice to hunt, to breed, and sometimes to den, sea ice loss from climate change is their biggest threat, and the reason the bears are listed as vulnerable on the IUCN's Red List of Threatened Species. What we learn about climate change impacts on polar bears in Hudson Bay can be applied across the Arctic to help conserve other populations. Climate change is already affecting some populations of polar bears. Since we get most of our energy from fossil fuels, we are producing huge amounts of carbon dioxide. You see, regular amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere act like a blanket around the Earth, trapping heat and keeping our planet at a stable temperature. However, when we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas for energy, we pump rampant amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This buildup thickens the blanket, trapping too much heat, disrupting the climate, and melting Arctic sea ice. When Arctic waters are cold enough, the top layer freezes into a special type of ice called sea ice. Sea ice is to the ocean what soil is to a forest. It supports the entire Arctic food chain. Food from this marine ecosystem also sustains northern communities. The key to getting the climate back to functioning the way it should, and to preserving a future for polar bears across the Arctic, is to move away from using fossil fuels for energy altogether. The most important thing we can do is vote with the climate in mind to let our leaders know we support a swift transition to renewable energy sources. In the meantime, we can directly participate in and learn more about our local and regional renewable energy options. We can all make a difference outside our own households by influencing where our energy comes from. Because together, we can make sure that polar bears roam the Arctic sea ice for generations to come.